Ever since Assassin's Creed 2, gamers have been craving an open-world, story-driven, action-adventure collectathon set in feudal Japan, and while Sekiro was phenomenal, it just didn't scratch that specific itch. But then at Paris Games Week in 2017, we got our first look at Ghosts of Tsushima, and I for one was absolutely enamoured. The visuals, the setting, the fact it wasn't just another generic white guy with an accent. Sucker Punch had come to feed that craving of these gamers. While 3 years later, it's finally here. But is it as sharp as a pristine katana, or is it as dull as a butter knife? That's what I'm here to find out. Welcome to Eat Sleep Game. My name is Luke, and I have been playing Ghost of Tsushima. As always, let's start with visuals. Now, ghosts can often look like any number of iconic Japanese paintings that have been rendered in the real world, with the vibrant popping colours of the red-leaved maple trees or the lush, seemingly infinite expanse of greenery. Throw in some truly awe-inspiring sunrises and sunsets, and this game's screenshots can look like they belong in a museum of their own. That being said, if you dig a little deeper, the experience is somewhat ruined by some quite poor patches of texture work. The ground and the sea are both pretty poor looking, and I occasionally found that some building interiors looked like a texture layer was missing altogether. The game's characters can suffer the same fate, with main characters like Jin looking pretty good for the most part, but will also occasionally look like a museum mannequin came to life. NPCs on the whole are pretty bad, more often than not looking really outdated. Finally, however, I do have to tip my hat to the devs that worked on the armor sets. They all look incredible in Ghosts. It's almost as if they stole the sets from a museum and Willy Wonka'd them into the game. Sound is up next, and it's a very similar story to the visuals. The score is absolutely incredible, pulling from Japanese entertainment using iconic instruments heard throughout Japanese history, such as shakuhachi flutes, kotos, shamisen, biwa, and taiko drums, which together make an outstandingly authentic score that fits seamlessly into the game's world. The voice cast is pretty solid too, with Koten-kan in particular being played fantastically well by Patrick Gallagher. It's just a shame you get to see so little of him through the game. While Jin is played well enough, he comes across very bland and monotone at times, however. I also found a number of times throughout Ghost that despite being right next to the character who was talking, they sounded like they were trapped in another room or in a wall. On the other hand, the environmental sounds are pretty great, from all the animals around the environment and the weather effects, even to the distant screams that alert you to someone in danger just out of sight. Again, however, the Kurosawa mode, while aesthetically being really cool, does ruin the sound quality by compressing all the sounds to mimic the 50s classic films, but this undoes so much of the great audio work done by the devs. I really feel like they could have added the Kurosawa mode without sacrificing the great work done by the audio. It is once again story time. You play as Jin, the son of a great samurai warrior and nephew to the head of the Shinra clan. You must protect the island of Tsushima against the overwhelming brutality, the invading Mongols and their leader. But they eliminate more or less the entirety of the samurai, and you are left to seek your revenge and take back Tsushima from the warlord. But to do so, you must sully your honourable name and become the ghost. While the story sets itself up well, it gets through most of its interesting sections far too quickly to then just revert to a paint-by-number story. Granted, they're using some pretty paint, but it would have made for a much interesting and rewarding story to throw in more grey and some even darker grey on top of that. The game urges you to play in that grey area, using a combination of your samurai training and your newly discovered ghost tactics, but it never really does anything beyond gameplay with it. For example, throughout the early marketing, it was talked about how you would either act as the honourable samurai or stoop down and become the dishonourable ghost. But in-game, there is absolutely no honour system whatsoever beyond a change in weather, which really makes how you play feel inconsequential. Most of the characters don't even really care all that much. Some will comment on it at first, but then it doesn't bother them moments later. The only character that cares is Lord Shinra, and even that has very little bearing on the way the story is going and doesn't hinge on the way you actually play. Ghost of Tsushima spends so much time trying to replicate the great samurai movies of the past that it lacks its own identity, feeling more like a pretty collage of the best bits from other media rather than telling its own narrative with its own interesting characters. Most of the notable characters you come across are extremely one-note and cliched, from an old teacher betrayed by his student after pushing them too hard, a mother who's lost her family due to the war, brothers with opposing views. These are all great points to start a story off, but they never really go any deeper, and any development they do get is inconsequential to the story as a whole. As a result, Ghost Story and characters lack any tangible depth to them beyond the tired old cliches. The only characters I found anywhere near interesting, those being the Mongol leader Khotun Khan and the Straw Hat leader Ryuzo, you don't get enough interaction with. Getting to see more of them and their development could have added so much, and honestly, I genuinely think I would have rather have just played as Ryuzo. His arc is far more interesting. Jin is possibly the worst offender of this lack of identity due to the position he's put in. He goes through the entire story mostly unaffected by anything. He's just a constant monotone of blandness. When he is faced with a difficult situation of having to abandon his long-held code and stoop to the level of his enemies to defeat them, he struggles for literally a couple of minutes and then he's off sneaking around and dropping Mongols from behind carefree. While I'm not normally someone that's overly bothered by ludonarrative dissonance, this was honestly unavoidable. Not just from Jin though. There's a lot of talk of honor from a number of characters, but then when it comes time to it, they all immediately back you without a second thought. Despite its overall beauty, the Tsushima game world is really shallow. It's a vast open space that has very little, feeling its vapid void. You will come across the same few roaming enemy groups and some wildlife, but other than that, you will mostly only find people in camps. And while like any other open world game, it has a huge amount of unidentified locations and collections, you never really have to do any work in finding, as there is a marker for practically everything in the game. And in cases like the fox dens, you will then be escorted to the location of the discoverable location with ease. If this weren't an open world game and more of an open environment style game such as Uncharted, Tomb Raider or God of War, the world would honestly feel so much better for me. But as it is, it's just too open and too empty, thus feeling lifeless beyond its admittedly wonderful aesthetics. The level design is again in a similar boat, although draped in traditional Japanese and Mongol design. All of the enemy camps, while different in shape and size, offer nothing more challenging than the last. The game is at its best when you are stealthing around setting off traps, but each camp has the same traps set up in very similar, if not identical ways. These camps should be a challenge and they should test all that you've learned in game, but you can easily get away with using the exact same tactics in each one because of the poor level design and even poorer enemy AI, but more on that later. Moving on to gameplay, and I've got to say again, it's pretty paint by numbers. Combat is fine, it's the standard fare you'd expect in this kind of game. It does have a nice flow to it when you get going, but it is made rather clunky by all the unlocks, most of which you could honestly either merge with another upgrade or just not be an upgrade at all, like the roll for instance. Why does a highly skilled samurai not already know how to do a roll? Getting into the stances, firstly, you have 4 to unlock and each is effective against a different enemy type. You unlock these by defeating an increasing number of Mongol leaders throughout Tsushima. Failing that, you can also just watch them for a minute or two. The stone stance, which is effective against swordsmen. The water stance is effective against shielded enemies. The wind stance is effective against spearmen. And the moon stance is effective against brutes. While this is a cool idea, in theory, it's just poorly implemented in game. Switching between the stances when you are fighting 3 or 4 different enemy types at once just makes the combat so clunky and monotonous. This is granted partly due to the poor UI, which we will get onto very soon. I also think it would have been far more interesting if you had to learn these new stances from different clans or characters, putting more emphasis on having to learn new ways to defeat the enemy rather than hiding in a bush and staring at a leader for a few minutes. Along with the 4 stances, you also unlock new deflection, evasion skills, tactics, ghost weapons, and stance moves, all of which gets their own individual skill tree, but this should all just be a single skill tree given how easy they are to unlock, and how honestly half of them are a bit pointless. Most of the initial upgrades are earned through the story, such as stealth, focused hearing, and your bow. After that, you need to gain upgrade points, which you earn by increasing your legend, which you can do by doing pretty much anything in the game. As mentioned, I really think this could have been compressed and condensed into one much simpler and far less clunky upgrade scheme. For instance, some of the upgrades would fit so much better at a vendor who can upgrade your other weapons, and some like the aforementioned role should just be something Jin can already do. And then there are other upgrades that are pure filler, just like any of the exploration upgrades, which will supposedly make finding undiscovered locations simpler, despite them already appearing on the map when you either explore the area or beat an enemy camp, thus discouraging exploration. By far the best part of Ghost's gameplay are the one-on-one battles. They are tense, they require a lot of focus, and are incredibly cinematic. But yet again, they are let down by the game. The camera often means you're not able to see where the enemy is, and by the time the camera is settled down, the enemy is just about to strike if you're lucky and they haven't already. Towards the end of the game, they become quite stale, repetitive, and honestly, the last few I encountered, bar the final one, which is genuinely the best fight in the game, were very spammy and just frustrating. Enemy AI is appalling at times. For example, even after you've been spotted on a roof, you can often still stealth kill an enemy, who will helpfully move into position for you mid-action. Enemies are easy to sneak past and on the whole are pretty simple to deal with. At one point I was sprinting up to an enemy who was looking directly at me. Despite that, I was still able to perform a stealth kill on him without anyone else noticing. It does however have to be said that I really like the approach to waypointing. The guided wind, while not new by any means, was a really good addition and non-invasively was there whenever you needed to get back on track. The UI is a bit of a mess. There is just too much going on. I found myself selecting a stance, for instance, and the menu not shutting quick enough, leading to selecting a different stance when I then tried to attack. Or conversely, sometimes the menu just wouldn't open and I was left jumping around like a moron. The stances should just be on D-pad, and one of either L1 or R1 could have been a weapon wheel or something to that extent, just to make it all a little bit easier to manage. Photo mode could easily fit on the touchpad along with calling your horse, because do we really need a dedicated button or swipe to sheath or sword when that could be used as a good indicator that you had finished the fight? The camera can be your biggest enemy in the game, often getting stuck behind an object midway through a fight leading to death, or in the case of the aforementioned one-on-one fights, the camera would just be all over the place when the enemy dodges. A soft lock would have been extremely useful. I don't need to swing the camera around when I'm managing the battle, my health, stances, throwables, and so on. Credit where it is due though, the photo mode is pretty awesome. You can craft some absolute frame-worthy photos. Each filter alone gives you a plethora of different incredible looks to a single capture. Everything from the cinematic bars to the depth of field and everything in between can be played around with to craft some awe-inspiring shots. However, adding in environmental particles like leaves, birds and the like can give your photos that added level of authenticity from classic movies, TV shows and Japanese artwork. Side quests are unfortunately just repetitive filler, and while character-based side quests are a little better, they still resort to go here, kill enemies, investigate area, find tracks, go there, kill more enemies, and while yes, this is a problem in a lot of open world games, that does not excuse it here. Eventually I just ignored all the side quests unless they rewarded me with something I wanted, like an armor set for example. Open world games like this live and die on their side content, and it's just nowhere near as strong as it needs to be here. There is little of consequence, or for that matter substance. As mentioned, there are a plethora of undiscovered locations. Fox dens where you follow a fox to an Inari shrine, which will grant you a new charm slot. Haikus, which grant the player new headbands for each site found and haiku created. Shinto shrines, which act as the Ubisoft towers that you can climb up and receive some waxwood and a charm which you can equip to your weapons to give you a perk, but these are so easily found throughout the game world it makes the admittedly occasional fun climbing sections almost pointless. There are pillars of honor where you can find new sword kits which again offer nothing bar a skin. If these offered buffs or a stronger weapon, I would have been much more interested in finding all of them. There are hot springs which grant you a health increase while Jin reflects upon recent events. While these can be useful early on, once you start leveling up, enemies become far too easy to cut down to warrant even going out of your way to find these hot springs. Bamboo strikes, where you can cut through an increasing amounts of bamboo and get a resolve upgrade, which are actually pretty fun distractions. And lighthouses, which do nothing really. They grow your legend a little, which can lead to a skill point or level you up, but generally it's such a minimal change, it's irrelevant. Again, credit where it is due. The use of the environment here is a nice touch that should have just been expanded on. For example, being able to follow a bird to an undiscovered location, or seeing the cloud of steam above a hot spring in the distance. Doubling down on these mechanics would have benefited the game hugely. Rather than just telling you where each location is, it would have been so much more enjoyable if you found locations by hearing rumors and following clues, or just following certain animals without all the map markers. It would have been so much more rewarding. Collectibles are a very similar story to the undiscovered locations and the game as a whole, unfortunately. There are a lot of different collectibles to find throughout the game, but they offer very little worthwhile reward. Singing crickets are found around the world, mostly in small enemy controlled areas, and they will unlock a new melody that Jin can play on his flute, which can change the weather. A nice touch, but pointless on the whole, as weather doesn't really make much, if any, difference to gameplay. Banners found in enemy bases can unlock new horse saddles when you have found enough, but once again are just a cosmetic item and offer no benefit or reward for all of your time spent scouring enemy camps. And both records and Mongol artifacts are simple environmental storytelling that offer either a small amount of history about the Mongols or some extra insight into certain characters, but, and I'm getting tired of saying it, once again offer nothing interesting, let alone useful. It genuinely feels like all the collectibles and undiscovered locations have been simply put in the game without much more thought than a bit of historical research. Would it have honestly killed the team to have saddles make your horse faster, or the Mongol artifacts and records give you some kind of useful in-game insight to the Mongols' tactics, or even made the weather affect combat so that getting all the singing crickets would actually be worthwhile? As is, everything past the main campaign is just a shallow filler that offers very little tangible reward beyond a metaphorical tick in a box. Throughout your journey through Ghost, you will unlock a small arsenal to aid you in defeating your enemies. Your standard fare katana and smaller sakai, which you can equip with different charms to give you perks depending on your playstyle, but honestly after you get the health buffs you don't really need to bother with any others. A half bow with standard and fire arrows, a longbow with heavy arrows capable of piercing armor and explosive arrows, a blowgun with standard poison darts and hallucination darts, distracting wind chimes and firecrackers, and black powder bombs, as well as some quick-fire throwables like kunai, which are small staggering blades, smoke bombs and sticky bombs. Despite the available weapons being pretty standard for this style of game, albeit with some more traditional Japanese flair, there is plenty here to mix with the two main playstyles to make combat pretty enjoyable on the whole. It's just a shame the playgrounds aren't varied enough to warrant exploring beyond your preferred weaponry. Finally, while I really like the look in the majority of the unlockable outfits, they don't offer a whole lot. The different masks and hats offer nothing, while the different armor sets do offer small perks, but they are hardly felt in-game, and upgrading them again offers little more than an upgraded look. I would have loved it if Ghosts had straight up stolen the armor system from Breath of the Wild and actually gave each armor set a tangible perk. Oof. Let's talk about the elephant in the room. I had so many issues while playing Ghost of Tsushima, starting with cutscenes, everything from frame rate dips, freezing as if the cutscenes themselves were buffering like a live video would, and often stuttering afterwards, and half the times characters were out of sync with their dialogue. Individually, these aren't massive issues. Altogether, it's worrying how unpolished these cutscenes alone are, considering how much emphasis was put on the game's visuals and aesthetic. Gameplay-wise, I encountered some similar issues with pop-in and frame rate dips. However, my two biggest issues are without a doubt the stealth, which I can't decide whether it's just poor game design or a broken mechanic. But more detrimental to my overall experience was the button delay issues. On too many occasions I found that Jin just would not respond to commands, from dodging and blocking to getting on his horse, and even simple attacks like drawing a bow or simple attack commands. I don't know anyone else that's experienced this kind of issue, and they are bit tricky to show in capture, but what I thought was a simple one-off issue just kept occurring and hampered what could have been the much more enjoyable combat sections. For reference, I tried 3 different controllers while this issue occurred and nothing changed. I've played multiple different games during and since playing Ghosts, and I've had nothing like this issue since. Ghost of Tsushima plays far too much on is admittedly great aesthetic, paying little attention to much else, and is very shallow as a result. The world is sparse, its side quests and collectibles are little more than filler, and its overall gameplay, while being the best part of the game, it just feels like a multitude of other open world action adventure games, and as a result Ghost lacks any real identity of its own. The game could have somewhat been salvaged by a solid story, but every single time I started to get on board with where the story was going, the game would go the other way and revert to its almost stereotypical and uninteresting storytelling. This, paired with the amount of issues I encountered, I honestly can't recommend this game unless it was in a deep sell. I tried so very hard to even like Ghosts, but in the end it's just so disappointing on almost every single level.